Hi, my name's Aaron Percival, and I'm a current Phase 2 DVM student at the Ontario Veterinary College. And this summer, I worked with Dr. Patricia Turner and master student Jessica Walsh in the evaluation of on-farm euthanasia procedures for commercial meat rabbits. There are currently no available guidelines for producers on the euthanasia techniques for on-farm euthanasia of meat rabbits. As well, any production species may become sick or require euthanasia at any point in any type of production situation, including meat rabbits. No research has been conducted on the optimal method for on-farm euthanasia for these animals. As well, this has led to inconsistency and concern across the industry, as approximately 12% of producers have actually received hands-on training on how to euthanize animals. Most of people in the industry have learned either through peers or just knowing growing up on a farm. As well, our current research has shown that the method used by each individual producer has varied quite a bit across the industry, with 54% using blunt force trauma being the most used technique across the industry, as well as 42% not using any euthanasia techniques for their rabbits, just letting them die on their own, which with any production species could cause sickness and reduced welfare. So proper training and research into the efficacy of different euthanasia techniques will help reduce suffering as well as improve the industry standard for euthanasia. So the objectives of our project were to evaluate the efficacy, the operator safety, the aesthetics, as well as other possible restraints for certain physical euthanasia techniques that can be operated directly on the farm by a producer. The materials and methods for this project, all these methods were approved by the Animal Care Committee of the University of Guelph. 3 meat rabbit farms volunteered their services to let us come in and do our trials. 3 of these producers did their own techniques. 2 of these producers did blunt force trauma, and 1 of them did their own cervical dislocation, and we considered them the experts for those particular techniques. And all these trials were done on animals that were already lined up to be euthanized on farm. So to take you through the techniques that we studied, we began with blunt force trauma, and we allowed the producers to use their preferred method of blunt force trauma on these animals. We had 2 different ones, as 2 producers were the ones who performed this procedure. One of them was performed by taking the animal over the head, swinging them down towards the ground and inflicting damage to the head primarily. The other one would be the producer holding the legs of the animal upside down and swinging a metal rod at the head. And this was considered blunt force trauma. After that, we had assisted mechanical cervical dislocation, which again was done by a producer who was considered an expert in this particular technique. And this technique involves having the rabbit's head held by a wall-mounted device and pulling down on the body to remove the first cervical vertebrae from the base of the skull. And finally, our last method was the Zephyr, which is a non-penetrative captive bullet gun. This bolt comes out about 3 centimeters from the barrel of the gun and is operated on compressed air that is pressurized to different PSI for different sizes of rabbits. And this inflicts damage directly to the brain and the skull of the animal, causing fracture and death. Each method was used on different sizes, as any size could succumb to an injury at any point on the farm and need to be euthanized. We broke up these categories into pre-weaned rabbits, which were less than 5 weeks, fryers, which were between 5 weeks and 11 weeks, adults between 12 weeks and 8 weeks, which are scheduled to become breeding stock, as well as breeding animals which are over 8 months old and could have been of ages beyond that. After the application of the technique, in order to be considered a humane euthanasia, the animal must be completely unconscious after the application and not return to consciousness to ensure that there is no pain or suffering experienced by the animal. The way we tested this, we're using 4 reflexes, which are indicators of consciousness. Immediately after the application of whichever technique, we would test the corneal reflex, which is done by touching a finger or a Q-tip to the eye of the animal and hoping to not elicit a response. If the response was elicited, the animal would be considered a failure of that particular technique and it would be operated again. After corneal reflex, we did pupillary light reflex, which is performed by holding a pen light to the eye of the animal and expecting no response from the pupil, so no pupil dilation. After that, we would use the palpebral reflex, which is touching the face in 3 different spots and hopefully not eliciting a response from the eye. And finally, we would pinch the ear to make sure that there is no response in that. And if all 4 of these were gone, we would consider the animal unconscious. After that, the natural death process would ensue. The animal would undergo convulsions and we would monitor these. and expect there to be no return to consciousness, which could be indicated by either vocalizations, rhythmic breathing, or different types of facial twitching. Even though some of these are normal responses in the death process, they are indications that the animal may return to consciousness, and we would further evaluate consciousness testing afterwards. Along with this, death was considered to be complete when the animal's heartbeat stopped, which was continuously auscultated using a stethoscope. Once the animals were completed, the trials were finished, we would bring the animals back to the University of Guelph, where we would conduct gross post-mortems on their bodies. When we did this, we would look at the head damage and the neck damage of any particular technique. As well with this, we had 4 friars from each of the groups, 12 in total, that would go for radiographs to assess the damage on a radiographic level. As well, all brains were sectioned for histology, even though not all of them were assessed. They were randomly assessed for each group. And then after that, they would go directly to Pat, who is a board-certified pathologist, and they would assess the damage. So just to show you a basic rundown of the results we've gotten thus far. Blunt force trauma had the highest level of failure, with 77.5% of our trials being successful, so about a 22.5% failure rate. As well, mechanical cervical dislocation had only 2 failures, which gave it a 96% rate of success. And then the Zephyr was completely successful on all trials. Now for blunt force trauma, we do believe that a lot of this failure had to do with the inconsistency of the technique, the fact that people will do it different ways and that each different animal will have a different result. As well, with mechanical cervical dislocation, we believe that the 2 failures occurred due to changing in size for the operator. Though we considered the operator quite skilled with the technique, the animals that shifted in weight of either extremes, either very small animals or very large animals, proved to be more challenging the first time the operator did these. And like I said, the Zephyr did not fail in any of these attempts. So just to run over our post-mortem results from each of them, the general damage is displayed by this bar graph. Blunt force trauma had quite a variable range of damage. Some animals did not have a lot of damage, whether other animals had quite a severe amount of damage to the skull. As you can see, that's represented in the average here. So it's about 1.5 was the average on a 5-point scale for skull fracture. For mechanical cervical dislocation, the majority of damage we saw was hemorrhage in the neck, as we expected. And the average score for this was 2.5, which was the highest of any technique for this particular scoring. As well, we have the Zephyr, which had quite significant skull hemorrhage scores, as well as skull fracture, as we would expect, as the bolt completely penetrates the skull. And we also did some radiographs, and I've presented them here just to show the general damage that's inflicted by each of these techniques. The cervical dislocation, you can see an obvious gap between the C1 vertebrae as well as the skull. Blunt force trauma, we see direct damage to the parietal bone and the frontal bone of the animal, which is fractured completely off the skull. And with the Zephyr, we see impacted skull fractures inside where the brain cavity is. Our conclusions after finishing these is that the Zephyr is extremely effective in rendering animals immediately unconscious without returning to consciousness and causing death. As well, we believe that mechanical cervical dislocation, when operated by a very skilled handler, will render an animal immediately unconscious for a variety of weight groups and lead to a successful euthanasia. Finally, blunt force trauma, as I said, is not as effective, but it does render the animals unconscious the majority of the time, but a more consistent application is required in order for us to deem it as an acceptable form of euthanasia. So with what we've learned from this previous research, development of training materials, as well as new codes of practice, will improve euthanasia techniques in the meat rabbit industry. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Slurp for letting me present my research, as well as all of my sponsors, Fumin Fard Care, Bach Industries, OMAFRA, as well as Ontario Rabbit. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed my research.